Our next question, Pastor Carl, comes in as anonymous. They write, I was recently divorced by a spouse who is an unbeliever. What do the scriptures say about me pursuing remarriage to my spouse since I am a Christian? Should I pursue remarriage with an unbelieving spouse or not? Obviously, we would be unequally yoked, so I'm not sure what God's word would have me do in this situation. If my former spouse wants to remarry again as an unbeliever, should we get back together?
Yes, you should do everything in your power to get back together, with the one caveat, as long as you and the children are not physically endangered. I know today people say, well, I've left him because he's abusive. Well, tell me how he was abusive. Well, he's just so ugly in terms of the language he uses. Okay, that's a terrible thing when a husband derides his wife and is unkind towards her. But is that a reason to leave? I think not. There is a sense in which the Bible teaches we should suffer unjustly. So there's obviously some room for some kind of discord in a marriage. In 1 Peter 3, in the same way you wives, in the same way as what? Is in the same way as Jesus Christ, who he just illustrated. In fact, he's illustrated on 3 different realms. Submit yourself to the Lord's sake to every institution, not just to those who are great governments, but to those who treat you unfairly. Then he'll say, servants, be submissive to your masters, not just to those who are great masters, but to those who are crummy masters. He says, what credit is there if when you sin and you're harshly treated and you endure it with patience? But if when you do what is right and you suffer for it and you patiently endure, this finds favor with God. And then he illustrates with Christ, for you've been called for this purpose. To do what? To suffer unjustly. Since Christ suffered for you and he left you an example to follow. And if there is anyone who ever suffered unjustly, because we can sometimes think about situations and we say, well, he's 99% wrong and I'm 1% wrong. Well, you're at least 1% wrong. You got to own that. But Jesus was never wrong. If there was anyone who ever suffered unjustly, it was Jesus, because he was sinless. He committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And yet he entrusted himself to God. In the same way, 3:1, remember the chapter divisions are artificial. You wives be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives as they observe your chaste and respectful behavior. So there are times, though, Paul just turned to 1 Corinthians 7, and he deals with, beginning in 7:1, with questions they wrote about it. Now, concerning the things about which you wrote. And so in 7:1, almost through the end of the book, he begins ticking off their questions and answering them. And so he says in 8:1, but I say to the unmarried and to widows that it is good for them if they remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn. He's talking about single people who may have thought it was more spiritual to stay single their whole life. And Paul's point is, only if God has equipped you to be single your whole life. And there are some people, as he'll argue later in the chapter, they're able to give undistracted devotion to the work of the kingdom, verse 35. Why? Because they're single. But most people God has wired to be married. And so he then says, but to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord. And this is in deference to what he'll say in verse 12, but to the rest I say, not the Lord. In other words, first he says, I'm giving instructions, but it's not really me. This is an issue Jesus addressed, not I, but the Lord. But in verse 12 he'll say, but to the rest I say, not the Lord. In other words, this is not a subject that Jesus addressed, but I'm speaking on his behalf as his apostle with the exact same authority. And so to the married, I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband. But if she does leave, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. The husband should not divorce his wife if the shoe's on the other foot. So he's saying if there's a time to leave and maybe he's beating you up, maybe he's a drunkard and he's abusive to the children, maybe he's potentially bringing disease into your body because he's immoral. And you say, husband, I'm leaving, but I'm not getting remarried because I made a vow to you until death separate us. And so I am not going to remarry. Now, you may have jumped through the hoops where you have a legal divorce in your hand. But God is clear, if she does leave, she must remain unmarried. Why? Because that's what Jesus taught when he spoke on the subject of divorce and remarry. So either be unmarried or be reconciled to your husband. And sometimes when a wife draws a line in the sand and says, look, if you're serious, you've made all these promises to me, and every time you make the promise and you'll say, I'll be different, and I come back, you just break it again. And she's despaired and she's lost all hope. Well, you draw a line in the sand and you make it clear that, look, this is going to be a planned separation. We're going to get marriage counseling during this time. And here are some non-negotiables. Does he have to be converted? No, because you made an original covenant to him. Maybe you made it in disobedience, where you knew he was lost and you thought, I'll marry him anyway because I love him and hopefully he'll get saved. It doesn't mean that that was not God's ultimate will for you to marry him, but because you married him in the wrong timing, you willfully sinned. Or it may be that you got married and then after you got married, you got saved. And that's one of the issues, no doubt, that Paul is addressing here, because they could have easily have come to a conclusion, maybe because we're unequally yoked, something that 2 Corinthians 6 says, don't pursue marriage with an unbeliever, that we should do what Ezra says, which was a unique setting and an example. And Paul says, no, stick together. In fact, he'll go on to say, but to the rest I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, hey, he provides for the kids. Certainly he's not born again. He doesn't think the way we think as a wife, and maybe some of my children who have met the Lord. He doesn't want to go to church, but he consents to live with me. He's a hard worker. He's a provider. And where you can show respect for him in front of the children, you should do everything you can to build him up and to submit to his authority, unless, of course, he asks you to do something contrary to the Lord. Your submission is in the Lord. And she consents to live with him. He must not divorce her. And a woman who has an unbelieving husband and he consents to live with her, she must not divorce her husband. Why? Because or for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband. For otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. He's just reminding them that your children are set apart by the believing spouse. It doesn't mean they're saved. It doesn't mean that he is saved. No one can get saved for anyone else, but God can put his blessing on the children through the believer that is walking with the Lord. And again, when you go back to 1 Peter 3 and couple the truths there in the first 6 or 7 verses, and I have a whole message on that. You might want to get the Search the Scriptures app and listen to the message on 1 Peter 3, 1 through 7. It will help you as a woman living with an unbeliever. You might also want to listen to my wife's series called Following Fallen Men. That's also can be found at Search the Scriptures or Mothering from the Heart. That would be a great series for you to listen to, where you can get some help and some encouragement. But your goal is not to get married. That goal is an impossibility if he divorces you and then he remarries. Then you can't be reconciled. But right now, there is a possibility for reconciliation, even if the government says you're divorced. You say, well, I've got this certificate here, and the judge says you're divorced, and God's got his marriage certificate in heaven. And he says, no, you're not. What God has joined together, no man is to separate. Anyway, it's a good question. I hope that helps. Again, listen to 1 Peter 3, the message there at searchthescriptures.org, or download the app and maybe listen to the series Following Fallen Men. It would be a great series my wife did in teaching women and helping women to win their unbelieving husbands or their disobedient husbands into obedience.
Dr. Carl Broggi answers your questions about the Bible and living the Christian life Tuesday mornings at 11 on The Light 88.7 FM and online around the world at wagp.net.